For the Magnify application, how in case you use zoom in?
I can zoom in with easy with this. It's a Mac.
All I knew was that you always brought some sort of Magnify application window.
That was for Windows. Yeah, for Windows you have to open the magnifier, and on a Mac you just press this, and if you go up and down, that's how you zoom in and zoom out.
Good
Yep.
to know.
Yep.
Good to know.
Okay, let's get started with functions. So, let's see what we're going to do with functions today. Alright, so let's say you have a piece of code that is something like, alright, I have a print and I have some stars, alright? And then what I'm going to do is, let's say I have, I don't know, 5 lines of stars, right? And later on, I have the same lines of code, right? So I have another 5 stars somewhere. Alright, so obviously I'm repeating the same code 2 times. Let me run it so you can see it work, right? And what I want to do is I want to have a way to recycle my code, okay? So that's where functions come in. So what I'm going to do is, let's say wherever this code repeats, I'm going to have my function call. I'm going to call it stars, right? This is going to be my function call. And the original lines of code is going to be where my function definition is. def stars, like this. And then I grab everything that I want it to be repeated, or whatever it is supposed to be inside of that function, and I just tab it. So anything that's indented underneath this function is going to be repeated whenever I call the function call, right? This is my function call, this is my function definition, right? The name of the function is stars, right? And I guess you could say that this is the beginning of function body, and this is the end of function body, right? So whenever I call, I execute everything in the function body. Okay? So I go in there, and remember before I had 2, in order for me to show this, I would just have to call the function twice. Stars, right? That's another call. Function call. Okay, if I run it, same exact thing. Okay? So that's just the basic function. Any questions? Good so far? Alright, so what do you need to know? Function name, function body, right? Whatever's inside the function needs to be indented the same. You can't have even a little bit off, right? If you do this kind of a stuff, it will throw a fit at you, like that, unexpected indent. Okay, in other programming languages, you have curly brackets to tell it where the function starts and ends. So we'll do things like you'll have a curly bracket here to tell it where it starts, and a curly bracket there to tell it where it ends. And indentation doesn't matter, but Python figured out, let's just get rid of the curly brackets and make sure the indentation is consistent, which is actually, I kind of like that. Okay, it teaches you, it teaches you good indentation. It forces you to do this. Okay, if I teach C++, students start doing this like weird crooked indentation, and it's like impossible to read the code. You have to tell them, hey, make sure you do the proper indentation. In Python, you don't have a choice. You're either going to indent this thing right, or you're just not going to work. Okay, so this is just a basic function. All right. Some other things are scope of variables and things like that, right? So let's say in here I have, let's see if this is going to work. So I'm going to have num here is equal to 10, right? And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to do right here, I'm going to say print num equals num, right? Let's see what happens. If I run it, oops, right? What is it telling me? It tells me the name num is not defined. It is defined, but it's defined inside of this function, right? So it can only be used inside of this function, right? So a variable that is defined inside of a function can only be used inside that function, right? And where a variable can be used is known as scope, right? So what is the scope? What is the scope of the variable num? So the scope of variable num is the stars function, right? So it can only be used in there. It can only be seen in there. So this thing here gives you an error. This is an error. Error because num is local to stars function. Okay? Which is different than, let's say, for example, a variable num2 is equal to 100, right? You obviously know that I can go in there and I can say, okay, print num2 equals num2, right? That'll work. All right, there's your num2. It's also okay for me to use num2 inside of these functions, any other function. So let's say in here, I'm going to go in there, I'm going to say, I guess this is your, the function body is all the way at the top. All right, that's your beginning of the function body. Let's say in here, I'm going to do something like num2 is equal to 300, right? So what's going to happen is I'm making num2 equal to 100 here. Then I'm going to go and I'm going to call these functions. These functions, whenever I call the functions, we're going to go in there, we're going to execute a bunch of code. Part of that code is changing the variable num2. So hopefully when I get to this point, you're going to see that it actually changed it. All right, so if I run it, oops, it didn't change it. And that is because I think you have to say global. Is it global? Yeah, global, save, run again. There's a syntax for you to make a variable. I said global num2. Is it global there? Let me see. One more time. I gotta look at the syntax for this. Global num2, and then num2 equals that. Nah, still doesn't change it. Anyway, there's a difference between a global variable and a local variable. I gotta look up the syntax exactly. Bottom line is, if you, in other languages, it's kind of like by default, if you have a variable defined before your functions, so a variable that's defined before and outside of other functions is automatically accessible by these other functions. So if you change it in the function, it changes it for the whole program. And in Python, you have to go and add a little extra thing in there. I'll fix it for you. But for now, the main thing that I want you to understand is that if you have a variable that is inside of a function and you're changing that, first of all, that variable is only accessible to this function. If I go in there and I try to do this to num, it's not going to work. Okay, there's a specific syntax. It's a little weird for Python, so I just can't remember right off the top of my head, where you can define a global variable and you can change it just like I was trying to do. Okay, I thought it would just do it on the fly. Anyway, so main thing I want you to keep from here is function definition, function call, what is the function body, right? What's a local variable? So num here, num is a local variable, right? And what's a local variable? Local variable is a variable that is defined inside of a function. And you cannot use a local variable outside of the function, right? You cannot use a local variable outside of the function where it was defined. Okay, so that's the important stuff. Okay, in fact, the thing that I was trying to do, the global functions, are not a good idea. Okay, because suppose you have a really big project, and that project is going to be broken down between the different programmers who are going to work on it. right? So you're going to get one of the functions, you're going to get another function, but I don't want either of you to mess with each other's data. And if you happen to have a global variable, it will be very easy for you to go and mess it up, and it will be very easy for you to go and mess it up. So we want to keep the variables local. We want to hide these details of the program so that different parts of the program don't mess with each other. Okay? So that's just a basic function. Now let's have a look at another kind of a function, right? So another kind of a function is a function which takes a value, right? So this is going to be a function that accepts a value, okay? And it's going to accept the value using a parameter. Okay, what is a parameter? If I have, let's say, df, I don't know, sum two numbers, right? And I have a num and b num, right? A num and b num are my parameters, right? So this, and this are your parameters, parameter variables. Okay, what is the purpose of the parameter variables? To accept some kind of a value that we're going to send into the function. So if I'm going to go in there and I'm going to do my call, sum two numbers, I'm going to send two numbers like this. Okay, so these values that I'm sending in, right, they're known as arguments. So this and this are the arguments, okay, which are the values we send into the function. Okay, as soon as I call the function above, right, the two parameters, a num is going to be equal to 1 and b num is going to be equal to 2, right? So basically this thing becomes equal to this value, this thing becomes equal to this value, okay? And then I can do things with these values like, all right, well, print, I don't know, let's say sum is equal to a num plus b num, and then print the sum of a num plus b num is equal to sum. Alright, so let's have a look at it. I run it. And there you go. Sum of 1 plus 2 is 3. So we can accept these values. Now, the beauty of functions is you don't have to stick with certain values. Now that you have a function that does a specific thing, you can send whatever values you want into that function, right? So if I send it 1 and a 2, I can later on do sum two numbers 10, 20, right? Run it again. Now it's that, okay? I don't have to put specific values. I can make variables. I can say, all right, a is equal to 100, b is equal to 200, sum two numbers, a, b, right? And again, this could be from the user, right? User can enter this, right? Both of them, okay? And if I run this, now it's going to run with a 100 and 200. Okay? So that's a function. Any questions? Okay? So you can send into a function, you can send variables. You're going to be sending the values of these variables, right? I'm not sending the variable a and b themselves. As you saw earlier, it's kind of hard for you to change variables from inside of a function if they're not declared in that function, right? So don't expect if you go in there and you try to do things like, oh, a num is equal to 0 and b num is equal to 0. Don't expect that to change these values here. Okay, if I go in there and I change these two like this, that will only change these right here. There's no way for me to change this unless I send a list in. If I'm sending a list into the function, then whatever change you make into the list applies to the list that you send into the function originally. Okay? But let's not go into that for now. So again, the important thing here is you have to know what a parameter is, and you have to know what an argument is, right? And now that you have learned this, now this little error message is going to be is going to make sense. So let's say I'm going to do something like this. I want to say, all right, a is equal to int input, and I say a equals a, right? And then I say, please enter another value, right? Like this. And if you've done enough programming already, you're going to know that this is not going to work, right? Why is it not going to work? Look at the error message. Input expected at most 1 argument got 3. So now that you know what an argument is, it should be pretty clear. It's expecting 1 thing, right? And you're giving it 3 things. This is the first thing, right? This is the second thing. This is the third thing. So it thinks that you're giving it 3 separate arguments when it's supposed to have only 1 argument. And that's why we had to do these magic things like plus str, right? And then another plus. That way I turn this whole thing into 1 big string, so now it's 1 argument, so I can send it in. Okay? That's why. Let's go back to this. Oops. Oops. That was this error message, right? This is, I'll put it right there. Okay? So I hope that, that's why it's important for you to know the terminology. I'm not just, just talking about these things. It's important for you to know what these are in order for you to decipher the error messages of your program. Okay? And if you know all the basics of the language, when you look at the errors, it kind of makes a lot more sense. Any questions? Good so far? All right. So now this is a function that takes in, a function that accepts values, right? Values using parameters. Right? So these are the parameter variables. When you call the function, you send in the arguments, you pass the values into the function, and then the function does something with them. You can send it different values, you can send it variables, right? Or the values of these variables. So these are 2 types of functions so far. So you had a function that didn't have anything in the parentheses, just a really basic one that just does some printing. Then you have a function which takes some parameters. All right. You can also have a function that returns a value. So let's say now we're going to have a function that returns a value. Okay? So let's say I'm going to have a def return a value, right? Value. Okay, so it's not going to have any parameters, not that it can't, but I'll just start with a simple one. And let's say this is going to have, I don't know, return 10. Okay? So now when I go down there and I do, okay, let me do my function call, return a value, like this, and I run it, you're actually not going to see the 10, right? 10 didn't show up. Why is that? Because when I call this function, we go into the function definition. When we get to the return, we're bringing back the value 10. So the effect of calling the function is basically the same as if I wrote the value 10 right in there. Right? If I run my program, unless it gives me an error, nothing happens, right? Because I didn't show the 10. If I wanted to show the 10, I got to do print 10, right? And if I wanted to show my function that returns a value, or what the value that the function returns, I have to do it as print return a value, right? Like that. So now if I run it, you're going to see 2 10s. Whoops, I didn't call it the right way. Like this. You got to do the parentheses, right? Run it. And now you're going to see 2 10s. Okay? So that's one way. So you have to either call it from inside of a print, or you can do things like this. So this is calling a function that returns a value. Okay? And now I'm going to do another way. Another way to call a function that returns a value. Okay? So I'm going to go in there. I'm going to say, all right, let's say returned value is equal to return value, the function call. That way, I'm going to call the function. I'm going to go into the function definition. I'm going to hit this return statement. I'm going to bring back the value 10 right in there. And now that's what this is going to be equal to. And I'm going to show that to you. Print returned value is equal to returned val. Okay, and I run it, and now you should see 3/10. Whoops, returned value. One more time. Oh, it's return a value. So my function name is not right, so I got to spell the name exactly as it is. There you go. One more time. There you go. Okay, so multiple ways or two different ways to call a function that returns a value. Okay, if you just call the function by itself, you're not going to be able to show the value. Okay, if you're trying to show the value or if you're trying to store the value. All right. So now let me show you a function that has a parameter and returns a value. So let's say what I want to do is I want to have write a function that checks if a number is positive. Positive. Okay? So let's say I'm going to go in there. I'm going to say, all right, df is positive, and let's say this thing is going to take a variable c, right? Whatever I want to call it. And then in here, I'm going to say, okay, if my c is greater than 0, I'm going to return true, right? Else, I'm going to return false. Okay? And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to write another if in here. I'm going to say, okay, if is pos, like this, equals true, right? I'm going to tell you, and the number is c. Oops. C, right? So let's say c is 1. Okay? Or, and again, the user can enter this thing. And I'm going to go in there, and I'm going to say, so if it's true, I'm going to give a message print the value c is positive. Okay? And if it's otherwise, if is pos c is equal to false, or you can say is not equal to true, right? Then you give it the message is negative. Right? So let's test it, see if it works. So I'm calling my function from inside of an if. Okay, run it. Value is positive. Okay, go back, make it a negative now. Check again. Okay, so that's one way to do it. Okay, and there's actually a way for me to simplify my code. Right? So this is, I'm going to leave it like this so that you know this worked. Right? And I'm going to leave this also so that you know that's the one that worked. Okay, and I'm going to rewrite it a little shorter. I'm just going to say, all right, I'm going to say return c is greater than 0. So remember that this right here is a condition which evaluates to either true or false, right? So if this is true, we're going to return true, and if it's false, we're just going to return false. So this is a way to shorten this lines of code, right? So instead of writing 1, 2, 3, 4 separate lines of code, I can just reduce it to this one line. Okay? So the above line does the same as the commented lines below. Okay? So I'm going to run it again. Actually, let's just test it like this first with this piece of code. Right? That's a negative. Now let's flip it back to positive. Check again. And that's a positive. Okay? So it works both ways, except this is shorter. Okay? Better code. All right. Now I'm also going to simplify this a little bit, right? So instead of doing it this way, I'm going to do this. Instead of doing it this way, I'm going to say, all right, if is pos C, just like that. I don't have to say if it's equal to true, because remember how an if works. If there's a true in there, it will happen, and if it isn't, it won't happen. So I'm going to change this here too. Elif is pos C. All right, let me add a little extra spaces so it looks better. All right, and I'm going to get the same message. So I forgot the little colon. All right. Same deal. All right, test it again. Make it a negative. Okay. Elif, let's try not is positive. There you go. Okay. Questions? All right, and then you can also write this. You could have written this also as elif is pos C is not equal to true. Right? So there's multiple ways you can compose these, the logic of your program. As you can see, right? You can do it this way, you can do it this way, you can do it this way, you can do it this way. Yes?
Well, just by saying F is pos C, how does it understand whether it's true or false?
Because the function returns either true or false. When I go in there, I call my function, I send in a value, we go in there, we check if the value is positive. If this is true, this whole thing becomes, whoops, damn it. This whole thing becomes either true or false. All right? Does that make sense?
Sort of, yeah.
It just takes some practice.
Okay.
Yeah. So you're sending in. It's just a way for you to. Now you can see the actual applications of these functions is basically you can have thousands of lines of code, right? But you're not going to go rewrite the same thousands of lines of code. You can just call the function, do it, let it do its magic, and then if it works, it works, right? And that's kind of like that is an example of encapsulation, which is you're hiding what. Basically, the idea is this: your functions are going to be the interface of like a complex program, right? So the example that I like to give is if you have, like, I have a remote control for a TV or something, right? I don't have to go in there and open up the TV and then figure out how it works and connect wires, right? I know that if I press this button, TV turns off. Same way, I just know how to press the button or how to call the function, and then all the little details of the function are not that important. As long as I know how to use the function itself, it simplifies my life a whole lot, okay? And that's the encapsulation, the data encapsulation, all that stuff, okay? Questions? So this is basically functions, and you can have functions that call other functions. So let's say I'm going to have I'll show you functions that call other functions, right? So let's say I have df f1. And then in that function, I'm going to go and call f2, right? So I haven't defined f2 yet, so I have to go, and you should always have your definition for the function that you're trying to call before you call it, right? So I can't go in there and call my function stars. Let me try to call the function, right? I'm going to try to call this first function right before I define it, right? I try to call it. Stars is not defined. It's defined, but it's defined after I called it, and the program works top to bottom. So you can't call, right? Cannot call a function before it was defined. Okay, that was this error that I got here. Okay, that's that. Okay, so same thing. If I'm going to be calling this function here, I can't define it there. I should define it before I call it, right? So I'm going to have a df F2, and let's say this thing is just going to tell me hi. All right, and then I have my F1, and then of course I'm not going to be able to call the F1 here because I haven't defined it yet, but I'm going to go in there, I'm going to do F1, just like that. Okay, and then run this thing, and hopefully you're going to see a hi message at the end. There you go, there's a hi. Okay, so other programming languages like Java, like C, like C++, they have a function called main, right? So other languages have a function called main, which is where the program starts. So how would you could totally write a main in your functions for Python. In fact, I'm going to ask you to do that pretty soon, probably one of these assignments for today. So how do you do this? Well, I'm going to make a main, df main, right? And inside my main, I'm going to call my, which one am I calling to start the thing? So which one do I have to call? F1 or F2? I can call both of them, right? But let's go with F1. F1, okay? And then if I run this thing, nothing's going to happen. You're not going to see the hi because why? Why didn't it show it?
What is your main?
Sure, but then what? How can I make it show the little hi message?
F1, F2?
Nope. Did I call the main anywhere? Nope. I got to call my main. Main. As soon as I call my main, we're going to jump to the main. Then we're going to call the F1. As soon as I call the F1, we're going to jump to the F1. As soon as I get into the F2, we're going to jump to the F3. As soon as I call the F2, we're going to jump to the F2, and we're going to execute whatever's in it. Okay? So this one, right? Call the main, which calls the F1, which calls the F2. Okay? So you can have functions calling other functions. Okay? That's totally okay. And there's going to be your hi at the end. Okay? Questions? So one more time, let's go through the basics. All right? So you have df stars. This is how you define a function. Stars is the name. All functions have these parentheses after them. If it doesn't have anything in the parentheses, that means it does not have any parameters. Okay? The function body is where the function starts and where the function ends, right? Everything that's indented inside it underneath the function is part of that function. The indentation has to be consistent. You can't have like even a single little space, it'll mess it up. You can have multiple calls of the same function so that you can recycle your code. That's the purpose of these functions. A function can have variables in between the parentheses. Those are known as parameters. Special name for them. Okay, a function you can send values into the function. You can pass values into it. Those are the arguments, right? The values that you pass into the functions are the arguments. They don't have to be values. You could send variables. You're still sending the values of the variables, and by sending these variables in there, you cannot change them. So there's no way for me to change the a and the b from inside this function. Okay, at least from what you know so far. Okay, you can have a function which returns a value. So when the function returns a value, you call the function, you jump to the function definition. As soon as you hit the return 10, it comes back with that value. Okay, let's see if I do a print hi or something. I'm not sure if it's going to give me a syntax error. So if you have anything after a return, you're out of that function. It's just like when you had a loop and you have a break in the loop. Nothing after the break is going to happen. As soon as you hit the break, you're out of that loop. Same thing with the function. As soon as you hit the return, you're out of that function. So this here, even if it doesn't give me a syntax error, is never going to show. All right? So never shows because it is after the return. Okay? So return is where you exit the function, returning the value 10 to where the function was called. Okay? And again, you can have a function which takes a parameter and then returns things like true or false. I showed you how you can write it one way. If this makes more sense to you, write it this way, right? Don't get too clever unless you're comfortable with the syntax. But if you want to shorten your code, this is how you do it. You can use your function calls. You can call a function from inside of an if. You can call a function from inside of a print, right? You can call a function from inside of another function. In fact, what do you think print is? Print is a function which takes a string. Okay? Right? Same thing with the input. What do you think input is? Input is a function that takes something, takes one argument. Okay? And that was the error that we got at some point. I don't know where it is. Right here. Right? Expected at most one argument got 3. Right? Input is also a function. All right. So this makes sense? We sure? All right, let me see if I have, yeah. So function return, calling functions, function parameters, all that good stuff. So I have this stuff broken down into separate little pages so you can look at them at your convenience. And I have a couple of assignments for today, which should be pretty straightforward if you understood what I covered. All right, one is supposed to be you're going to check to see if the num, right, and test a function which returns the absolute value of a number. So let's say if you call this with the number 1, it will return the number 1. If you call it with the number -1, it will return the number 1. If you call it with the number 10, it will return the number 10. If you call it with the number -10, it returns the number 10. So you're going to have like a little if in there. If the number is less than 0, multiply by -1, right? That kind of stuff. Just basic things. The next one, sum double. You're given 2 integer values, right? You're going to return their sum unless the 2 values are the same, in which case you're going to return double their sum. So again, you're going to have a function. Now it takes 2 things, and you're going to have an if in there. You're going to check to see if they're both equal. If they're both, so first find the sum, right? Then check to see if the first number is equal to the second number. If they are, multiply the sum by 2, and then return the sum. All right? So just a simple function with an if in there that returns a value. Okay? Both of these functions are returning. So make sure if I say return, you use a return for your function. Right? So you got to have a return in there. Okay? You are not going to do this kind of a business. Right? If I tell you show me the sum of 2 values, you're not going to do a print. If I tell you return the sum of 2 values, you're not going to do a print. Right? You would do a return. Okay? That's that one. Then the next one is divisible. Right? Write a function named is divisible that takes 2 integers n and m and returns true if n is evenly divisible by m and false otherwise. How do you check if one number is divisible by another? Like this. Right? N is divisible by j if n modulus j is equal to 0. Right? If the remainder is 0 when you divide one by the other, it's evenly divisible. And you can test it just using this. You don't bother yourself with, ask the user to enter a number. Just call the function one time with one set of numbers, call the function another time with another set of numbers, just like I was doing here, right? Do it one time this way, do it another time with another set of numbers. Again, if I don't say ask the user to enter input, don't bother with the input. Okay? Keep it simple. Mult_add. Alright, write a function called mult_add that takes 3 floats, a, b, c as parameters and then returns a times b plus c. Right? Write a main function which starts the program and calls the mult_add function giving it these 3 arguments. Right? So you have to understand what's a parameter, what's a return, how you call one function from another, and what's an argument. Right? If you don't understand the basic syntax that I covered today, this is not going to make any sense. And if you do, it's a piece of cake. It's like 3 lines of code. Okay? So that's the mental gymnastics for this. And is triangle. Right? So if you're given 3 sticks, you may or may not be able to arrange them in a triangle. For example, if one of the sticks is 12 inches long and the other 2 are 1 inch long, you will not be able to get the short sticks to meet in the middle. Man, this thing's all messed up. Let me line it up. It just bothers me. All right. And save. Okay, so if you're given 3 sticks, you may or may not be able to arrange them in a triangle. For example, if one, yeah, I already got it, right? So what's the test? For any 3 lengths, there is a simple test to see if it is possible to form a triangle. If any of the 3 lengths is greater than the sum of the other 2, then you cannot form a triangle. Otherwise, you can. Okay? So you're going to write that function named isTriangle that takes 3 integers as arguments, and that returns either true or false depending on whether you can or cannot form a triangle with these sticks. Okay? Call the isTriangle function from the main, which starts the program. So there you go. Now you have a function that calls another function. Okay? And that's it. That's the end of the assignments for today. Any questions? All right, so get started. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll come over and I'll help you. And that's the end of this one. Okay?